Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. We're going to be continuing our look at English literature GCSE with Paper 1, Shakespeare and the pre-19th century novel, and continuing our study of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, the novella that deals with the character of Ebenezer Scrooge and his transformation as a protagonist. Today, we're going to be looking at the very first part of Stave 3, one of the more interesting sections of the story in terms of imagery and the use of allegorical characters. But we'll be coming back to that in a bit more detail when we go on to part 2. So today we're going to be considering the big question, how does Dickens challenge Victorian values? And so we'll be bringing in a little bit of contextual knowledge under AO3, but as usual, we'll be continuing our look at the language and the form and structure of the text, considering some of the themes and ideas running through it. So for the most part, we'll be concentrating on AO2, and making sure, of course, that you understand the text. So we'll continue reading the story and occasionally pausing just to kind of talk through some of the ideas in each of the extracts. So let's crack on. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, the especial purpose of holding a conference with a second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. So in this section, what's happening is Scrooge is preparing himself for the visitation of the second spirit, the ghost of Christmas present. And because he was somewhat taken aback and surprised by the last one, he's trying to get control of the situation by drawing back his bed curtains and getting himself ready so that he can see the new spirit coming on. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two and being unusually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as hardly as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. So what's happening here is we're getting a bit more of the indirect free speech from the narrator, kind of commenting on Scrooge and commenting on him getting ready, and basically saying that he's kind of getting himself ready, this capacity for adventure, this idea that he's preparing himself for whatever may happen. And we get this lovely use of humorous imagery there, the idea that if something appears to him, he'd be ready for anything from a baby to a rhinoceros. So he really is kind of on edge, getting ready to kind of see what's going to come his way. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time, he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion without having the consolation of knowing it. So Scrooge has been getting himself ready for the appearance of the next spirit and thinks that he can kind of get power and control over the situation by drawing back his curtains and getting ready. But what he doesn't anticipate is nothing happening for a moment. So rather than having control in the situation, he's now once again experiencing a degree of terror and alarm because he's not sure what's going to happen now. Now, something very interesting happens as well at this moment. We get a sudden blaze of red light. Ruddy means kind of reddish. And it streams upon him on the bed as soon as the clock proclaims the hour. So the minute the bell goes, this light appears, but he can't make out what's causing it. Right? He's not sure what it means, where it's come from. But of course, from a symbolic perspective, we know as readers that light equals truth and knowledge, this idea of the Enlightenment again. And so this is obviously part of the introduction of the next spirit who's going to illuminate Scrooge and help to teach him the error of his ways. So the symbolism of the light is very, very important once again. We also get this lovely use of humour here, because when Scrooge sees the light, he starts to worry that it might be some kind of warning of spontaneous combustion. Now, this is a bit of a strange idea, this one, but there was, in Victorian times, this belief that it was possible for the human body to burst into flame of its own accord. And there were quite a few mysterious deaths and quite strange circumstances which gave rise to this idea. For the most part, though, it is just an urban myth. Of course, modern science has dispelled such an idea, and it's simply more than likely that these people had died in fairly ordinary circumstances, but the conditions of which were somewhat strange because Victorian science was in its infancy when it came to things like forensics. And in fact, forensic science didn't come along until much, much later. So these kind of strange deaths, or seemingly strange deaths, were mistakenly attributed to the body catching fire of its own. So when Scrooge sees this glowing fire blazing on his bed, he starts to worry that it might be him starting to catch fire. But all it is an example of some humour, another case of the narrator poking fun at Scrooge's panic and worry. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it's always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. So what's happened is Scrooge has realised that this light is actually coming from the next door room. And we get this nice use of an embedded subordinate clause. This kind of nice long sentence here is the indirect free speech of the narrator stepping in, and again making a humorous observation that it's always the people who aren't experiencing something or always seem to know what should be done. It's this idea of, oh, if that happened to me, I'd do this or I'd do that. And the narrator's making a joke about it, that we might be able to kind of criticize Scrooge for his kind of panic, but if we're in that situation, really, would we know what to do? Who knows? But nevertheless, he realizes that the adjoining room, which means the next door room, is the source of the light, and so he goes to go and investigate and find out what's going on. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, for every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrifaction of the hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. So Scrooge enters his room and he realises that whilst it is his room, it's been changed. It's transformed into something that he barely recognised. And it's because it's being decorated with lots of plants, lots of gleaming berries and mistletoe and holly. And of course, in Victorian times, it was quite normal to decorate a room for Christmas using plants. So holly, mistletoe and ivy, things like these are associated with Christmas time. The kind of modern Christmas decorations that we think of were a more recent invention that began to be popularised towards the late Victorian period. But at the time, it was predominantly plants and things which would be used to decorate a room. And of course, we get this nice use of a metaphor. It looked like a perfect grove. A grove is like an outdoor place where things grow. It's kind of like a little green area where we get lots of plants and trees and bushes and things. And so it looks like the outside has come inside Scrooge's home. And on top of that, we get this blazing fire, mighty blaze, nice adjective, mighty, and this very strong description of the fire, roaring, so we get a lovely verb, roaring up the chimney, to kind of emphasize the scale and strength of the fire. And we're also told, of course, that the half has never seen such a fire before, because, of course, Scrooge is quite a stingy character. Now, you might be wondering as well what this word petrifaction is, because it talks about this dull petrifaction of a hearth. A hearth is the fireplace, the surrounding kind of ceramic and stonework and so on that goes around a fire, so that if a coal or spark goes outside the fire. It doesn't catch fire onto the living room or the room it's in. But petrifaction means to be petrified, turned into stone. So what's really being said here is that because Scrooge barely uses his fireplace, it's very rarely warm, it's kind of turned to cold stone over a period of time because of Scrooge's stinginess when it comes to making fires. And of course, the idea of the imagery of things turning to stone, kind of like Scrooge's heart in a way. He's kind of cold-hearted, been turned to stone by his greed and his lack of compassion for his fellow human being. So it's a nice use of imagery here. Heaped up on the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch, there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. So the thing to note here is the rather extensive and somewhat excessive description of the food which has been set out here to form a gigantic feast. We get these rather extravagant descriptions, lots of interesting pre-modifying adjectives that emphasize the scale of the feast. Great joints, these large joints of meat, long wreaths of sausages, there's abundance of food everywhere. There's not just a few oysters, there are barrels of them, there's great big containers of them. Even the actual objects themselves are described as being kind of full of vitality and life. So we get juicy oranges, luscious pears. They get the emphasis on the colour of the apples being cherry cheeked. And so we get all these kind of extravagant descriptions of food designed to emphasize this idea of abundance and plenty. And we get this allusion to the Horn of Plenty. Now, this is a reference to a character of mythology, various depicted in things like statues, such as this one. A character who kind of represents nature and nature's bounty, who gives out food and sustenance to people. And so we get this horn crammed full with foods and fruits and things, because the idea that nature can support all and is abundant and caring. Also depicted in paintings and sculptures. So there's the Horn of Plenty, and various kind of paintings showing Plenty sat on a throne bestowing food upon people. This idea of the kindness, the bounty of nature. So that's what's kind of being played upon here. And in a way, what this is doing is kind of a response to the ideas of people like Thomas Malthus, who felt that nature wasn't able to support everyone. But we're going to come back to this moment and this introduction of the spirit a little bit later on. So we'll leave it for the time being and crack on with the story. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before this spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. So there's quite a lot of imagery within this introduction of the spirit, and we're going to come back to this as an extract, look at how we might write about it. But let's just do a quick read through some of the striking features that we see here. So the first thing, of course, is the spirit kind of humbles Scrooge. This idea of reverence is kind of like religious worship or respect. So already we're starting to see Scrooge recognizing that these spirits are divine, that they're powerful, and that he needs to show them respect. And these are kind of signs of the beginnings of his transformation and his beginnings of him returning to some kind of morality. Interestingly, we get some nice use of color here. So the green robe of the figure, the green robe of the spirit represents this idea of nature. It's quite symbolic. So the idea of nature and its life-giving properties, food and fruit and what have you, are all kind of represented here in the symbolism of the color green. On top of that, it has a collar of fur made out of this white material. And this white fur, again, is quite symbolic because the color white, of course, represents purity and goodness. So what we're being told here is that this spirit is essentially the spirit of nature and kindness, and it's here to show Scrooge that it is possible to be benevolent and kind. It's here to show Scrooge that there's no reason to be stingy, that there is enough to go around here. The ample descriptions of food and the descriptions of its ample folds, ample meaning large and spacious. On the one hand, it's suggesting the spirit is actually kind of a fat figure, probably because it's eaten lots of this nice food. But it's also this idea of nature as being, full of life, fat with kind of its resources and its potential and the things it has to offer all humanity. And the idea of its kind of bearing its flesh and showing its kind of nakedness is this idea, again, that it's got nothing to hide. It's pure, it's noble, and it's not attempting to hide anything anyway. We're also told that it's got a genial face and sparkling eye. Genial just means friendly. And sparkling, of course, is kind of part of that idea we've seen earlier of brightness and light. And again, these things symbolizing purity and goodness. It has an open hand. So this open hand is like a gesture of friendship, which is reinforced, of course, by its cheerful voice. It's being friendly. And it's, full of joy. So this is a very positive description of nature. It goes very much against some of the more negative considerations of nature we see in the ideas of people like Thomas Malthus, who felt that nature was likely to run out of resources if the population kept growing without things like war and disease and hunger to control the population growth. So this is very much a kind of opposed view of that. Nature is a bountiful force with plenty for everyone if everyone learns to share. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I've not. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "Tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. So again, we're getting this idea of, Scrooge's concerns are about the population growing too much. He's very much the kind of Malthusian idea of the Malthusian catastrophe, population getting too big for nature to support it. But of course, the hyperbole of the number of brothers the ghost has had, it's 1,800, is just there to show that actually, it's more than capable of providing for everyone. Now, this could also be a kind of an oblique reference to the year this has taken place in. So the 1800 might actually be the century that the story takes place in. So this idea that nature has been able to provide for everyone for hundreds of years, and it will be able to continue to do so. Although that's only one way of looking at it. The point really is simply that the spirit is more than capable of providing for all. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. So what's happening here is, Scrooge is now kind of submitting to the will of the spirit. We're starting to see that he's willing to learn and change. He wants to profit by the lessons. He's kind of opening his mind to what's going to be shown to him. And then, of course, the spirit transports him to a different scene to show him, Christmas and what's going on. So we get, again, a repetition of the long list of foods that were part of the feast, again, emphasizing the idea of abundance and plenty, that nature can provide for all, just before they vanish and reappear in the city. And even though the weather is severe, it's still winter, we're being told that it doesn't bother people, that they're making a kind of music. So this idea of this kind of metaphorical idea of the preparations for Christmas being musical and pleasant and people enjoying themselves. We get people making mad delight, playing with the artificial snowstorm. So as the snow falls off the rooftops or from the windows and the doorways, it's creating these little snowstorms, which is creating delight for them. So Scrooge is being shown that Christmas can be a time of joy and pleasantry if he's willing to kind of embrace it. The house fronts look black enough and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs and with the dirty snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in showers of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to fuse in vain. So again, although it's winter, we get the idea of the black streets and the blacker windows. We get this lovely juxtaposition, this contrast with the white sheets of snow. And again, white representing purity and goodness. So the white here reinforcing the values of Christmas. And we're also told that although this the weather is quite dingy, we've got the yellow mud and it's quite cold with the icy water, and the sky is also gloomy. So we get this association with the negative weather. What we're told is that partly it's caused by the carbon atoms, the soot from the house fires, because all the fires, all the chimneys in Great Britain have caught fire and blazing away to their dear heart's content. So again, this idea of light imagery equaling goodness and purity and joy and all those positive things. And the idea of a fire having a heart, of course, personification. And it's a personification of the thing we associate with love and compassion. So it's this idea that everyone out there in Christmas, although the weather's very cold, is having a lovely time and enjoying themselves, experiencing great cheerfulness. And in fact, despite the gloom and the dark and the cold weather, we're told that, even if it was a clear summer day, it couldn't bring the lightness and cheerfulness that people are already experiencing in Christmas. So again, Scrooge is being shown the possible joy he could be taken from Christmas time if he were to open his heart a little more. For the people who were shoveling away at the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish friars, and winking from the shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. So there's lots of interesting imagery going on in this section. We get the playing of the people who are working to clear the snow from the housetops. They're throwing snowballs at each other, laughing and enjoying each other's company. We've got the poulterers, the shop that sells things like chickens and turkeys and any other kind of birds that you might eat. They're still open. We get the fruiterers who sell fruits with their radiant displays of fruits. So radiant meaning full of life and energy and brightness and giving off heat. So again, imagery of light being used throughout. And then we get all this abundance of description of foods. We get the basket of chestnuts, personified as like the waistcoat of jolly old gentlemen. So this idea of the big fat, abundant amount of chestnuts. And then we get some wonderful imagery here with this idea of that the chestnuts are spilling out in the streets in their apoplectic opulence. Opulence meaning to be very, very luxurious, very rich, very over the top, and also showing off. And apoplectic actually means rage or angry or to be infuriated by something, as if you're popping with anger. But it's being used here humorously, as if the luxury and the richness of these chestnuts is spilling out with energy into the streets, because there's just so much being contained in the store. And then we get the kind of personification of some of the other fruits and things. The idea that these, fat fruits and things are looking at the girls and being rather naughty, mischievous, winking at them slyly as they go by and looking at the mistletoe. So the foods and fruits there are kind of also being personified. And again, it kind of ties in with this idea of nature being presented as opulent and able to provide for all. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish, set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and, to a fish, went gasping round and round the little world in slow and passionless excitement. So again, we get this kind of rich description of food, long listing of food that is being displayed. Gratis just means free, by the way. So this idea that these displays are there to make everyone's mouth water, there's no charge to be able to see these things. They're being put on to display and please people as they go by. Obviously, they're there to try and encourage people to buy them, but nevertheless, these things are being displayed for all to see. We get various kinds of apples and pears on display, and contrast of the colours. Again, all these lovely colours reinforcing the bounty and benevolence of nature. The idea of great compactness. So it's lovely, almost oxymoronic juxtaposition, the idea that they're compact, tight and small, and yet at the same time, great and huge. So this idea that they are full of life despite their size, these kind of small fruits pack a lot of goodness inside them. And the idea that the fruits are personified again, that they're entreating and beseeching, which just means like begging and pleading to be taken home. It's almost like the fruits are speaking to people as they go by, asking to be taken home. And in the displays in these shop windows, we've also got some fish in bowls being put on to kind of brighten the place. And the fish are swimming around, and even they know that there's something going on. And they're kind of going round and round a little world, watching everything happening. So again, all this life, all this vitality there in the scene, reinforcing this idea of nature as this bountiful, giving life force. The grocers nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps, such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruit so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. Wow, so this is actually one very long bit of indirect free speech, and it's also technically an incredibly long subordinate clause in a way, because it's kind of this idea that this isn't actually the focus of what the narrator wants to say. Basically saying it's not these things that are what's going to be so impressive. It's not the figs, it's not the sticks of cinnamon, it's not the coffee smells. So we get this long list of the things that he's not going to talk about, although by doing so he's mentioning those things as well, so reinforcing the richness of the foods. And indeed, it's very hard to read that and not end up feeling hungry, because it's going to move on to the next idea, and it's to do with the customers. But the customers were also hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, clashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas doors to peck at if they chose. So this idea that the grocers providing all these kind of foods and sweets, and people are in such a rush that they're sometimes forgetting the things they're buying, coming back laughing at themselves. And the grocers and everyone's being really honest and friendly. Frank and fresh means kind of honest and truthful, and fresh in the sense of being friendly and personable. And this idea that the polished hearts, which they fastened their aprons behind, so this idea they've got these little heart-shaped things to heart-shaped knots to kind of tie their aprons, might actually be this idea of them wearing their heart on their sleeve. It's an idiom meaning to be friendly and open with people, and have your heart on the outside, to kind of show your trustworthiness, your friendship, your kindness. And so it's this idea of, again, this rich scene of human life, everyone having a wonderful time, enjoying Christmas, everyone except, of course, for Scrooge. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gravest faces, and at the same time there emerged from the scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. So what's happening now is that the spirit is showing some of the other people kind of hustling and bustling, going to get their Christmases ready, some of the poorer people kind of flocking and running around. And what's interesting is that when we do see some people having an argument, the spirit seems to have some kind of magical ability to sprinkle some kind of liquid onto their foods, some kind of incense, which is like a perfume or a fragrance, designed to restore their joy and their kind of tranquility, make them happy again. And so again, we get this idea of the spirit as a kind, benevolent force there to help everyone and make sure everyone's having a nice time. Might explain why the spirit's visiting Scrooge. In time, the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking, and the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is. My own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given, to a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. So some really interesting idea here. Scrooge is just kind of curious about the things that the spirit is sprinkling on people's food, because he's thinking, well, everyone's got different meals. Would this change the flavours of those things? What's it doing to them? We ask, is there a particular flavour to what he's sprinkling on them? And then he asks about the idea that it's different depending on how poor someone is. So the people who are poor get the most flavouring, the most kind of benefit from it. And Scrooge is wondering, why would the poor get the most of it? And that's because, of course, the poor need it most. So we're getting now the moral message here, the idea that those most in need are the ones who should be given the most support. So this is very much the kind of the moral of the story here, this idea that the rich need to do more to help the poor, and the rich need to recognize that the poor are the most worthy of that support. They shouldn't be cast out to workhouses or treated with disdain and disrespect. Far from it. They should be helped by those who are able to help. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought, I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. Aye, cried the spirit, you would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day in which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? Aye, cried the spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the spirit. So an interesting thing going on here is that Scrooge is kind of puzzled why the spirit would see that the shops are closed on Sunday. So Sunday, of course, is a day of worship, and so that's when shops and things close. So at least it used to be the case in Victorian times. I know nowadays shops are often open pretty much all the time. But it was very uncommon in Victorian times. Shops were made to close up on Sunday. It was seen as a day of rest. But Scrooge is a businessman. He would much rather have every opportunity to make money. So he's wondering of why he would close the shops providing foods, because he thinks, well, if you close those shops, you're stopping these people going there to buy the nice foods to have. But of course, there's something else going on here. This idea of the spirit seeking for something. So the question is, what is the spirit seeking? Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. So this idea of the spirit seeking for something, what's seeking for humankind to kind of find peace and love and tranquility and all those things. So the idea of having a day for worship and rest and family and friends is very much part of that. And the spirit's also challenging this idea that the rich who claim to do their deeds in the name of good actions or good things are actually very much doing it for their own selfish passions, their selfish pride. Indeed, even in some cases out of hatred and jealousy, that's what envy means. Bigotry, so prejudice of various forms, but mostly just because they're selfish. So it's this idea that, the rich think that they are acting generously and acting for the benefit of others, but the spirit's pointing out that actually they're not. The spirits have no idea what's really going on with those people, that they are essentially alien to them. It's like they never lived. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. So some interesting things going on. Now, of course, the Scrooge's clerk is Bob Cratchit, so the spirit has taken him to see Bob's home. That's what dwelling means. It's another word for a living place where someone has their home. And, of course, the spirit blesses him by sprinkling the torch onto the house. And then we get this indirect free speech, a nice short declarative sentence, which has an imperative tone to it. Think of that. It's telling us to think about it. It wants us to dwell on this idea. Essentially, we've been told that Bob had money, 15 bob a week, that's his salary. Bob is kind of slang for money. So a bob is a slang term for a shilling. So before the currency was decimalised into pence and pounds and so on, it used to be a case that a pound was made up of shillings, 20 shillings. So 15 shillings a week, it's not a lot of money. So we're being told essentially that, yes, Bob has got a job and he brings home money each week, but he's essentially what we might now today call the working poor. So again, this commentary going on here about the way in which rich people deliberately underpay their staff because they want to keep them poor. They want to keep their social order very kind of hierarchical, very regimented, with the rich and the elite on top and the working poor very much kind of in their place. And so we're being told here by the narrator and by extension by Dickens that we should think on this idea that just because people have a job doesn't mean to say they're not poor. And it's a very much a kind of commentary that applies, you could argue, equally today. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. So we get a lovely scene here with the family. We've got Mrs. Cratchit. She's wearing a poor, twice-turned gown. So basically, she's kind of bought some second-hand clothing. It's been kind of turned down. She's kind of done repairs to it, kind of worked on it, and she's decorated it with lots of ribbon because ribbons are cheap. They only cost 6pence. So she's putting on a show. she's trying to kind of, overcome the poverty and be cheerful and happy with what they have. So she's very much a positive character, and her daughter's the same. She's also dressed up in ribbons to mask the fact that they are so poor. And Peter Cratchit, who's enjoying himself, kind of, the guy who looks things, making mashed potatoes, he's wearing a shirt that's been handed down to him by his dad, and he's so kind of happy about it that he kind of wants to go off and show off this shirt in the fashionable parts, because as far as he's concerned, wearing his dad's shirt is a really kind of privileged thing. What he doesn't seem to realize, of course, is he's wearing that because they don't have a lot of money to buy their children their own clothes as such. So again, we're getting a sense of their poverty running through this, but also a sense that the poverty hasn't impacted their spirits. They're still cheerful, they're still happy, they're still enjoying their lives. So again, this message to the rich about the true value of life and living not being in money. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they'd smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. We get a continuation of the scene at the Cratchits. We get the younger Cratchits coming in, and again we get this really energetic verbs tearing in, means like running or racing in. They're screaming, so large volume in the house, lots of energy. They smelt the goose outside, and they know it's their food, so they're really excited. And this idea of them basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. We get this lovely moment of almost bathos, really, because they're basking in luxurious thoughts, these wonderful kind of rich luxury thoughts. But actually what they're thinking about is something really ordinary and mundane, a very cheap stuffing made out of sage and onion. So basically these herbs that are used to kind of flavour meats, but they're not particularly expensive. So it gets lovely contrast here. So it's a juxtaposition of the luxury with something quite ordinary, mundane. So bathos, we just put that on there for you, means a sense of anticlimax being caused by going from the sublime to the kind of ordinary or the ridiculous, which is what happens here. These young Cratchits danced about the table. So again, continuation of this idea of their energy. They're dancing, their joy, they're happy, exulting. So they're praising their brother who's making their potatoes. And then even the potatoes seem to join in. They're bubbling up. So the energy of their boiling is also part of the idea of the energy in their joy. And then they get personified as if they're trying to be, they're knocking to be let out and peeled. So the potatoes themselves are personified as part of the energy of the family. They're joining in as well. So it's a wonderful scene of energy and happiness taking place in the Cratchit house. "What has ever got into your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha want as late as Christmas Day for half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with a vicious zeal. So we're seeing the other Cratchits arriving. Martha's running late, but everyone's really delighted to see her. So we get this kind of the energy of the household, this idea of the zeal, so energy and kind of passions. So her mum going through, playing very much the motherly role, caring for her daughter, and the whole family excited and happy to be together. So you've got to think about the kind of contrast, really. We've seen Scrooge in his home, isolated, alone. We get the kind of echoing, booming sounds of the place. He's very much on his own. And by contrast, the Cratchit house is much smaller, but it's crammed full of life and energy and joy. There's a lovely kind of juxtaposition with the kind of the isolation and essentially the silence of Scrooge's home. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you're come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." No, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. So Martha's basically been working very late. She's come home. So we get a sense of the poverty of the family, that even the children are having to kind of go out and earn money to help support the family. So she's come back from working a long shift and about to have a drink, but because the young children realise Dad's nearly home, they encourage her to join in the games and play essentially kind of almost hide and seek, surprise dad. So she joins in the fun because she's, takes part in the kind of Christmas festivities and enjoying themselves. And then we get the entrance of Bob in his threadbare clothes. Threadbare means that you can literally see the threads. So the clothes are very old and worn. They've been darned up, so they've been repaired by Mrs. Cratchit. But he's doing his best to look seasonable. So they're all trying to put on a good show despite their poverty. But then we get the introduction of Tiny Tim, one of the key characters in the story. He's a Tiny Tim, so the alliteration of his name, but also the fact that his name references his small stature because he's not grown properly. He's suffering some kind of disability or illness which has left him very, very small and very feeble and weak. He's having to support himself with a crutch to walk, and he's even got limbs on an iron frame. So, this idea of Tim being very vulnerable, very weak, very dependent on the help of others. And of course, the family don't really have the money or the means to look after and care for him properly. So all the while, we kind of have this great pity and sympathy for the family. But we admire them, nevertheless, for the fact that they try really hard to be happy, regardless of the difficulties of their personal circumstances. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits. For he'd been his blood horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. So they're all playing a joke on him. He's asking where his daughter Martha is, and Mrs. Cratchit keeps up the joke of the other children, saying she's not come home for Christmas, and he's really, really sad about the idea, and she can't bear to see anyone unhappy on Christmas, so she comes out and greets him and runs into his arms. That's how much the family love each other. And then we get this lovely, energetic description of the young Cratchits hustling Tiny Tim, so they're carrying him, bearing him into the wash house, where they've got essentially a copper kettle which is being used to boil their Christmas pudding. So the idea of food and things, all the celebrations, all the energy, and also the fact the family being happy together, sharing that time together, very important ideas in the story. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." The family is so poor, essentially, that Bob has taken Tiny Tim to church, not just to kind of mark the Christmas day message and the idea of obviously Jesus' birthday and all the kind of religious symbolism that goes with it, but also get him out of the house, I suppose. And while they're there, rather than thinking about himself or praying for his own betterment and health, Tim's actually thinking about other people. He's thinking, isn't it good that other people see him with all of his problems, because it will remind them of Jesus and the miracles that he caused through God to make other people happy and live better lives. So he's still not even thinking about himself, even though perhaps if anyone does have just reason to be sad about their condition, it's Tiny Tim, but he's not. He's always thinking of others, and he's a much more positive character. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. So, as Bob is talking about the goodness of Tiny Tim, his voice gets tremulous. It means it shakes because he's on the verge of crying with the emotion that he's feeling about his son, because he's obviously very, very touched that his son is so selfless in his thoughts. And he's also hopeful that his son's going to survive, that he's growing stronger and hearty and more kind of full of life. Of course, we know as a reader that Tiny Tim is very vulnerable and very weak, but Bob's kind of hopeful that his son's going to survive. And then, of course, we get a continuation of the kind of the energy and the activity in the house. We get some more lovely indirect free speech with this lovely embedded clause of the narrator stepping in and pointing out just how poor Bob's clothing is. It's as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby. So Bob's turned up the sleeves of his shirt to try and stop them getting dirty or grubby or more worn out as he's preparing the food. But the reality is, as the narrator's pointing out, is that the clothes are beyond getting any more poor and shabby because he's so poor. But nevertheless, he's kind of trying to put on a good show of being considerate about his clothing. So he's a good man. This word ubiquitous means occurring everywhere, being seen everywhere. So it's again the idea of the two younger Cratchits racing around the house and being everywhere all at once because they're so excited by Christmas. When they go to get the goose to bring it in for the dinner, they almost come in some kind of parade, this high procession. It's almost like religious overtones. Just they worshipping the goose because it's such an important symbol of Christmas and family. So they're very, very happy to be carrying it to the table. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, for which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves. A mounting guard upon their posts crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that as a meat, goose itself wasn't particularly expensive or rare. It was kind of a fairly ordinary thing. But for this family, of course, it is seemingly quite rare. They don't have a lot of money. So for them, the goose is a source of great delight and joy. They don't have the money for something like a turkey, which would be a lot more money. And the children are so excited, they're cramming spoons into their mouths so that they don't cry out because they're waiting for their turn to get some of the meat and the food. And they're kind of full of excitement and joy about their Christmas family dinner. At last the dishes were set on and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" So they cut the bird open, ready to eat and serve, and everyone gets really, really excited and delighted, and even Tiny Tim cries out. But it's worth pointing out that the adverb used to describe his cry is feebly, and that adverb means weak, lacking in energy. So a constant reminder that Tiny Tim, as his name suggests, is weak and vulnerable. But the family are celebrating together with this kind of great delight, and they're really happy to be together. So again, this lovely contrast with Scrooge and his behaviour being presented through the Cratchit family. There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses to take the pudding up and bring it in. So, interesting things going on here. The family are praising the food and saying how much they enjoy it and how tender the meat is, how soft it is, how tasty it is, how large it is, and yet how cheap it was to buy. So they're all kind of admiring the food, but what's really going on is they're putting on a brave face. They're making the most of the fact that they don't really have very much. So this word eked, this verb means to kind of try to make something small last a very long time. So the idea of eking something out with applesauce and mashed potatoes is telling us that they're really having to make the meat go round by supplementing it with lots of cheap sauce and potatoes, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough food. And the fact that the youngest children are steeped, so to be steeped in something means to be soaked in something, so they're steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, is kind of pointing out the fact that the thing that they've eaten most is actually the stuffing for the meat. It's not actually the meat itself. So again, lots of little clues here that the meal itself, although they're saying it was sufficient for everyone, it's not really true. They're just putting on a brave face and trying to not let their poverty have a dampening effect on their Christmas joy. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day, that was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other. The laundress is next door to that. That was the pudding. So Mrs. Cratchit goes out to the wash house, which would have been most likely a separate building at the back of the house, where they've had this copper kettle slowly boiling and cooking their Christmas pudding. And they have these worries that someone might actually have stolen their dessert. And so she goes to get it. And of course, we get the smells coming in, wafting around. Lots of exclamatives here. Hello, a great deal of steam. So they've steamed the pudding, and we get the smell of the cloth it's wrapped in coming through, which gives us this kind of mixture of strange smells of like laundry and food all together. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. What's been worrying Mrs. Cratchit is that she's made their Christmas pudding, and they don't have a lot of money, so they can't make a very large pudding. She's worried it's not going to be enough. In fact, we get this nice imagery again of heat and fire, literally because what used to happen is you'd pour some brandy on top of pudding and light it to kind of add to the flavour. We're being told that they can't really afford very much, so it's half a quartern of ignited brandy, so very little alcohol at all, because they're not wealthy enough to really dress their pudding properly. But they made the most of it. They stuck some Christmas holly in the top as a decoration, and we get the exclamative, oh, a wonderful pudding. This is interesting because it's actually the narrator stepping into the minds of Bob Cratchit and the family. It's indirect speech. We don't have any speech marks here, but we're being told about everyone's delight in the pudding. And even though we're kind of getting hints here that there wasn't really enough flour to make a pudding big enough for the whole family. So they haven't got enough food. But no one has got the courage to say anything, and no one would dare do so because it would be heresy. Heresy is kind of like to not believe, to go against God. Being a heretic is someone who kind of disagrees with the common views. So they wouldn't do such a horrible thing. To them, it would be almost being like anti-religious to criticize the family dinner because they know how much love and care the mums put into the food. So they're not going to make fun of it or criticize it in any way. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one. And at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire spluttered and cracked noisily. So Bob's now going around. They haven't got many items of crockery or glass in their home, so he's just going around pouring out sauce to go on the pudding, but they don't have very much to do it. So he's going around, but everyone is delighted and happy to be there together celebrating. And again, we get this look of beaming looks, of like imagery of light and heat throughout, because of course this is a happy scene. We get a fire, so imagery of heat and warmth whenever we see something to do with family or goodness. And it's continued here as he goes around pouring out the custard sauce onto their pudding. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live. To kind of finish the kind of Christmas meal, and basically Bob wishes everyone a Merry Christmas. But then what happens is Tiny Tim takes it kind of a stage further by saying, God bless us, everyone. So he kind of expresses Christmas wishes for every person on earth, all humanity, this idea of the generosity of his spirit. And it's quite significant that it's coming from Tiny Tim because, of course, he has the least of all. He's got this disability. He's obviously got the very real threat of a short lifespan ahead of him. And of course, he's living in poverty. So he has very little reason to be generous in his spirit. And yet that's exactly what it is. He's kind of very generously wishing Merry Christmas to everybody. And it's a very important idea, this idea of the kind of the morality and the generosity of the poor. And it's being used here as a kind of lesson here to the rich to kind of do their fair share in supporting society, taking upon themselves the responsibility to care for their fellow man. But also interesting here, we get Scrooge kind of showing some interest for the first time. He wants to know if Tiny Tim's going to live. So we're starting to see some sympathy, some empathy coming in here. I see a vacant seat, replied the ghost, in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. No, no, said Scrooge. Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race, returned the ghost, will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, you'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Scrooge asks the spirit if he can tell him what's going to happen to Tim in the future, and the ghost makes this kind of rather unpleasant prediction that if things don't change in the future, then Tiny Tim will be dead. That we'll have this vacant, meaning empty seat, and an abandoned crutch, because, of course, if it's left there and it's not being used, it's because Tiny Tim is no longer around to need it or use it. So Scrooge begin to realise that he has a role to play in preventing things like this from happening. And of course, the spirit reminds us that it's actually humans rather than God that are responsible for bringing about change in the world. And this is where we start to see some of the political messaging of Dickens. Dickens, although he was living in a very religious time and he went to church, what have you, he wasn't particularly religious in his own kind of worldview. He felt very much that mankind had a responsibility to look after their fellow man. Praying to God for change or deliverance was never going to be enough. So what he's saying here is that these shadows, these spirits, can't do anything. Ultimately, it's going to fall to humans to make the changes necessary to save the poor from their miserable fortune. And the ghost does something really, really interesting here. Right? In this point in the story, he's quoting back to Scrooge the line that he says in Stave 1 about the poor decreasing the surplus population if they die. When the charity collectors in Stave 1 come to see Scrooge and ask for a donation, Scrooge is very dismissive of them and says, let them go to workhouse or the debtor's prison. And if they are going to die, they may as well get on with it and decrease the population. So what we're getting here again is a return to the ideas of Malthus, this idea that poverty and death and disease, which are all represented here in Tiny Tim, because of course his disability is the result of his poverty and disease. These are, the way in which Dickens is making this abstract idea of Malthus into something very real, very kind of personal, and something which is more unsettling. He's taken that abstract idea of Malthus and making it very real and kind of representing it in a character so that we realise just how insensitive and cruel Malthus's view of things actually could be seen as. And that's an important idea. Man, said the ghost, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling, cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. So the ghost essentially is telling Scrooge off for his wicked views on things, this idea of the surpluses and where it is. So again, we're getting into the economic ideas of Malthus. Malthus believed that if the population grows without checks and balances to increase the death rate, eventually nature will run out. There won't be enough surplus resources to keep all mankind alive. But what this ghost is doing essentially is challenging that view and that's saying, well, where is the surplus? This idea that the rich are taking more than their fair share, right? So he's challenging this idea, well, what right do the rich have to decide who lives and who dies? In the eyes of God, in the eyes of heaven, as is here, it might be that the rich are more worthless and less fit to live than the poor. So we get this nice metaphor to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust. So basically this idea of the insect complaining about the population of hungry insects who are dying in the dust, it's very much a kind of use of metaphor to kind of bring in the ideas of Malthus and criticize it, and in some ways to dehumanize Malthus and make him seem more monstrous by likening those ideas to the ideas of an insect. So something lacking in compassion and humanity. So there's some very kind of rich things going on here in terms of the AO3. But of course, a rebuke means to tell off, so Scrooge feels that he's been told off and realizes it, and it makes him tremble, and he looks down upon the ground, which is quite symbolic because when you look down on the ground, it suggests that you're feeling guilt, and that's very much what Scrooge is experiencing here. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it. My dear, said Bob, the children. Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, said she, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. Bob is actually very kind of grateful. He's raising a glass to toast Scrooge, his employer, because ultimately, of course, it's the wages from Scrooge that are giving the family the means to buy this food. But Mrs. Cratchit gets quite angry, and she uses the term ironically, because, of course, as far as she's concerned, Scrooge's tight-fistedness, his stinginess with the money, the fact he's a miser and doesn't pay Bob very much, is why they are living in poverty. And so she's very angry at him and considers him an odious, meaning repugnant, repellent, nasty, disgusting, stingy, being tight with your money, hard as in hard-hearted or cold-hearted, unfeeling, meaning insensitive. So we get this really nice list of adjectives to show just how much Scrooge is regarded by the Cratchits. With the exception of Bob, Bob's actually a good man. He's still respectful of Scrooge, even though if anyone has a right to dislike him, it's him, which is exactly what Mrs. Cratchit points out herself. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I've no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. So what we're learning here is basically the family don't like Scrooge. They call him the ogre of the family, the metaphor meaning quite literally he's the monster that kind of haunts them because he doesn't pay enough money for them. So their toast to him is somewhat ironic. They're raising the glass more for the sake of it being Christmas than because they actually respect him. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, and the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with him. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. So what we're learning here is that Bob's been looking for a job for Master Peter. Master is basically the name that a man would take before he kind of becomes an adult. So you go from Master to Mister. So it's reinforcing the idea that Peter is actually still very, very young. And the idea of him earning 5 and 6pence weekly, it's not very much money at all. So we get this idea here, this ironic idea of it being a bewildering income, because to him, it seems like a lot of money, but we know, of course, it's very little. but it shows us just how desperate they are for money that they're willing to send their children out to work to try and make ends meet. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a long-lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. So Martha basically makes hats, she works at milliner's, and she has to work long hours, but her employers are much nicer than Scrooge because he's willingly and happily given her the day off for Christmas, whereas Scrooge, of course, if you remember, was very begrudgingly willing to give Bob the day off, and talked about it being like Scrooge having his pocket being picked by a thief. So she's going to take the day off to rest. She works long hours. Now Peter's thinking about the idea of working as well. So we're getting a sense here that the family really struggling to make ends meet. And then we get this rather symbolic song about a child lost in the snow, and it's sung by Tiny Tim. And plaintive just kind of means very thin, very weak little voice. So this idea is symbolic because, of course, he, in a way, he is kind of lost, because unless Scrooge and wealthy people like him do more to help the poor, there's not really much that's going to be done to help him. There's nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. We're being told that they are a very poor family. They're not well dressed. But nevertheless, even though they have very little, scant means very little, so their clothes are scanty, they don't have much. And we're being told that at some point the children have been inside pawnbrokers. A pawnbroker shop is where it's a bit like a cash converter or one of those sorts of shops where if you haven't got enough money, you can take your possessions and get money for them, and eventually, hopefully, buy them back again if you make enough money. So this is how little they have. Occasionally they've had to sell things in order to kind of make ends meet. But nevertheless, despite their poverty, they're still happy. Get the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch. Again, the idea of imagery of light and joy, but the spirit is sprinkling stuff on them again because it reminds us of that idea they said earlier that the people who need it most are the poor. And so he's more generous with the poor, where he sprinkles his magical torch and the incense and liquid from it. So we're going to pause for the time being, and we'll break this into a couple of parts. We'll be reading the last part of Stave 3. We're also going to take a look at some extracts and think about how we might analyse them and write about them in more detail. So until next episode, take care and bye for now.